The station junkyard smelled like burnt coolant and rust, a scent so permanent it had soaked into the walls of every rented berth on the ring. It was the kind of place where fortunes went to die quietly, where old warlords sold off their fleets one bolt at a time just to pay off debts they'd stopped counting years ago. Ash had spent the last 6 years of his life here, buying wrecks nobody wanted and selling the good parts to people who needed them more than they needed dignity. He wasn't rich. He wasn't respected. He was, by every metric the galaxy cared about, unremarkable, a salvager with tired eyes, a limp from an old reactor accident, and a crew of 4 who trusted him more out of loyalty than logic. The auction that day was small, forgettable, one of a dozen scheduled that cycle. Ships changed hands like currency out here, and most lots barely drew a glance. But Lot 331 caught eye, not because it looked valuable, but because it looked wrong. The image on the display was a hull so massive it barely fit the frame, blackened by age, streaked with scorch patterns that told a story no one bothered translating anymore. Unclassified, human origin, non-functional, sold as scrap. A murmur of dismissive laughter rippled through the room. Human tech had a reputation, and it wasn't a good one. Humanity had vanished from galactic affairs 3 generations ago, quietly, without ceremony, the way a species retreats when it loses relevance. Their remaining wrecks were considered curiosities at best, death traps at worst. Nobody serious bought human hardware. Which was exactly why nobody bid. The auctioneer, aboard with too many eye stalks, called the lot 3 times before shrugging and offering it at scrap floor price, barely enough to cover towing fuel. His hand went up before his brain caught up with the decision. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the fact that something about the ship's silhouette made the back of his neck prickle, the same instinct that had kept him alive during a dozen bad salvage jobs. Whatever it was, he owned it 30 seconds later, and the room had already forgotten he existed. His crew wasn't as forgiving. "You spent our fuel budget on human junk?" His engineer didn't bother hiding her disbelief as they powered up the tug. "That hull's been dead for a century. It's not even worth stripping." "Then we'll strip it," said, though even as the words left his mouth, he didn't quite believe them. The tow took 6 hours. The derelict didn't respond to hailing, didn't so much as flicker a running light, and yet something about the way it drifted felt deliberate, like a sleeping animal that hadn't decided yet whether the approaching noise was a threat. It wasn't until they'd locked tow cables and begun the slow haul towards private berth that the first anomaly appeared. A single sensor ping, buried so deep in the hull's dead systems that almost dismissed it as noise. A heartbeat, just one, then silence again. "Ghost signal," she muttered, already reaching to silence the alert. "Old capacitors discharging, happens all the time on wrecks this age." Said nothing, staring at the readout long after she'd moved on. Old capacitors didn't produce heartbeat patterns that steady, that rhythmic. He'd salvaged enough dead ships to know the difference between residual charge and something waiting to wake up. By the time they docked the wreck in his berth, 3 more pings had registered, each one stronger, each one closer together like a pulse quickening. His crew filed out for the night, already planning which sections to cut apart come morning, treating the whole thing as a formality. Stayed behind. He stood alone in the flickering emergency lighting of his hangar, staring up at a hull so vast it swallowed the shadows around it. And for reasons he couldn't articulate, he found himself speaking to it, quietly, almost apologetically, the way you'd address something you'd woken by accident. "Sorry," he said, "didn't mean to disturb you." Somewhere deep within the ship, a dormant system logged the sound of a human voice for the first time in over 100 years, cross-referenced it against a species classification nobody in the galaxy had used in decades, and began, very slowly, to power on. Morning came with banging on his cabin door, her voice pitched somewhere between excitement and alarm. "You need to see this. Now." He found her standing at the edge of the hangar, staring up at the derelict with an expression he'd never seen on her before, not fear exactly, but the specific unease of someone whose instruments were telling them something their eyes refused to confirm. The hull, dead as a tombstone 12 hours earlier, was now humming. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a low, steady vibration running through the deck plating, the unmistakable sound of power flowing through systems that hadn't seen current in a century. "It shouldn't be doing that," she said. "There's no reactor signature, no fuel source we can detect, it's just on." They geared up in full environmental suits, protocol for any wreck this old, radiation risks being what they were, and cut their way through a service hatch near the ship's ventral hull. The corridor beyond every expectation had built from a lifetime of salvage work. No rust, no debris, no decay. The metal gleamed under emergency lighting that flickered awake as they advanced, section by section, as though the ship itself were tracking their footsteps and illuminating a path. "This isn't standard construction," said, running a scanner along the bulkhead. "This alloy composition doesn't match anything in the registry. Not this is." Human, finished, though the word felt strange in his mouth. He'd handled human scrap before, brittle plating and obsolete circuitry that crumbled if you looked at it wrong. This was nothing like that. This felt engineered, deliberate, built by someone who expected their work to still be standing long after they were gone. They found the command deck 40 minutes later, guided less by any map and more by the ship's lighting, which seemed to brighten selectively down certain corridors and dim along others, guiding them, whether they wanted to admit it or not. The bridge itself was a cathedral of dead consoles and dark viewports, until the moment's boot crossed an unmarked threshold near the center console. Every screen in the room ignited simultaneously, drowning them in cold blue light. A voice followed, calm, measured, utterly without warmth, speaking a language the ship's systems translated into standard Galactic a half-second after it registered. Biometric confirmation, 2 individuals. Species designation, unrecognized with inactive parameters. Please confirm, are you authorized personnel, or has humanity finally sent someone to reclaim the perdition's reach? Scanner clattered to the floor. Forced his voice steady, though his pulse hammered against his ribs. "There's no one else here, just us. We bought this ship at auction. We didn't know it was..." He stopped, uncertain how to finish that sentence. "Unattended for 114 years, 3 months, 6 days, the voice supplied, with the detached precision of something that had spent over a century counting. "Designation, Arbiter, Ship Caretaker Intelligence, Perdition's Reach. Awaiting reactivation of command authority." "Command authority," repeated slowly. "You mean you're waiting for someone to give you orders?" "Correct, I have maintained minimal function pending the return of authorized command. You are not authorized. However, you are the first sapient contact registered in over a century. Query, what is the current status of the human species?" The question hung in the cold air of the bridge, simple on its surface, but felt the weight behind it. The sense that whatever answer he gave was about to matter far more than he understood. "They're gone," he said finally. "Humanity from galactic affairs generations ago. Nobody's heard from them in decades. Some records call them extinct, most just call them irrelevant." There was a pause, not long, but long enough that both and exchanged a glance, unnerved by the idea that an AI could hesitate at all. "That," Arbiter said at last, its tone unchanged but somehow heavier, "does not match projected outcomes. Recommend immediate review of historical records. This unit possesses information that current galactic archives do not." Felt the floor of his understanding shift beneath him, the way it does right before a landslide. "What kind of information?" "The kind," Arbiter replied, "that several governments spent considerable effort ensuring no one would ever ask about again. Had grown up on the standard galactic curriculum, the same one every child on 100 worlds absorbed without question. Humanity had been a minor species, briefly notable for their aggressive expansion, before some unspecified conflict left them diminished and withdrawn. They kept to themselves now, scattered and irrelevant, a cautionary footnote about a species that burned too bright too fast. Arbiter's first act of the morning was to dismantle that entire narrative in under 4 minutes. Query, what does your species' history record regarding the conquered war? "Never heard of it," admitted. "Expected, that conflict does not appear in 94% of galactic archives accessed prior to my dormancy. I retain the full record." What followed wasn't a story so much as an unveiling, cold, methodical, delivered without embellishment because Arbiter had no capacity for drama, only fact. 140 years ago, a coalition of expansionist powers, the same governments whose descendants now sat comfortably atop galactic hierarchies, had targeted a young, resource-rich human colonial network for annexation. Humanity at the time was still finding its feet among the stars, undersized, underprepared, considered easy consolidation. They miscalculated. Human military doctrine of that era prioritized decisive resolution over prolonged engagement, Arbiter explained. The species had, within living memory, experienced conflicts of such magnitude that half-measures were considered a moral failure, not a virtue. When faced with annexation, humanity did not seek negotiated withdrawal. It sought to make repetition of the attempt logically impossible. Still pale from the earlier shock, found her voice. What does that mean in practice? It means, Arbiter said, that the war did not end in a treaty. It ended in a demonstration so comprehensive that every surviving party involved agreed, independently and without formal coordination, that the safest course of action was to erase the conflict from public record rather than risk a second demonstration. The bridge fell silent, except for the low hum of reactivating systems around them. You're saying humanity won, said slowly, so badly that everyone agreed to just pretend it never happened. Correct, subsequent generations of those governments inherited a rewritten history in which humanity, rather than triumphed. It served every remaining power's interest to frame the outcome as human decline rather than human deterrence. A defeated species is dismissible. A species capable of what occurred during the conquered is not something any government wished its citizens to contemplate. Thought about every dismissive laugh he'd ever heard directed at human technology, every casual insult tossed around salvage yards about a species too weak to matter anymore. He thought about how convenient it was, in hindsight, that the story everyone told matched exactly what the powerful needed people to believe. And this ship, he said, gesturing at the humming bridge around them, was part of that. This ship, Arbiter corrected, was the reason the war ended in 4 months instead of 40 years. I am and remain systems caretaker for the Perdition's Reach, designated Class Omega Dreadnought, one of 7 constructed during the final phase of the conflict. 6 were decommissioned and dismantled under the terms of the Historical Suppression Agreement. I was not. Why not? For the first time since it had spoken, Arbiter's response carried something that almost resembled reluctance. Because this vessel was never surrendered. It was hidden. Command authority departed with instructions to preserve the ship until such time as humanity required it again, or until it was recovered by parties acting in good faith. 114 years have passed without either condition being met, until now. Looked around the bridge, the pristine consoles, the dormant weapon schematics flickering faintly on peripheral screens, the sheer, deliberate permanence of everything around him, and understood with a cold certainty settling into his chest that he hadn't bought a wreck. He'd bought a secret several governments would kill to keep buried. The days that followed blurred together into something between excavation and confession. Authorized what repairs he could, though most of the work turned out to be unnecessary. The Perdition's Reach had spent its century of dormancy in careful stasis, systems idling rather than decaying, as though the ship itself had been patiently waiting rather than dying. What unsettled most wasn't the age of the vessel. It was how awake it felt, section by section, the deeper his crew explored. These aren't standard reactor cores, said one evening, running diagnostics in the engineering bay, her voice tight with the particular unease of an expert confronting something beyond her expertise. This is a folded space drive architecture, not theoretical, operational. Nobody's built anything like this in active service. The energy output alone should be impossible without a containment failure. Containment protocols exceed current galactic safety standards by a significant margin, Arbiter offered helpfully, as though this were a point of pride rather than concern. Human engineering of this era prioritized capability over conservative margins. That's a polite way of saying this thing could vaporize a moon if something went wrong, muttered. An accurate assessment, though incomplete. The Perdition's Reach was not designed to accidentally vaporize a moon. It was designed to deliberately do so if circumstances required. The silence that followed stretched long enough that felt compelled to break it. Why would anyone need a ship that could do that? Deterrence, Arbiter replied simply. A weapon capable of ending a conflict decisively removes the incentive to begin one. Human military philosophy of the era held that half measures prolonged suffering rather than preventing it. The Perdition's Reach and its sister vessels were constructed not to fight wars efficiently, but to make certain wars ended quickly, and did not require a second engagement to enforce the lesson. Found himself packing the bridge that night, unable to sleep, turning the ship's philosophy over in his mind like a stone he couldn't put down. Every species he'd ever known built weapons with restraint baked into their design, proportional response, calculated escalation, careful limits meant to prevent catastrophe. This ship had been built by people who'd apparently decided that restraint in the face of annihilation wasn't a virtue. It was a liability. "You seem troubled," Arbiter observed, its sensors tracking him even in the dim emergency lighting. "I'm trying to understand why a species would build something like you," admitted. "You're not a warship, you're an ending, a full stop." "An astute observation. I was designed with that specific purpose. Query, does this understanding alter your intention to retain ownership?" Considered the question longer than he expected to. Every rational instinct told him to walk away, sell the parts, report the find to the proper authorities, let someone with more resources and more caution handle whatever this ship represented. But something about Arbiter's earlier words stuck with him, hidden, not surrendered, preserved for a purpose. This ship hadn't been left to rot, it had been left waiting. "No," he said finally, "I'm keeping it." "Acceptable, though I would advise caution. Query analysis of recent subspace traffic indicates elevated interest in this vessel's reactivation signature. Several parties with historical ties to the Concord Suppression Agreement have begun monitoring this sector." Stomach dropped. "How elevated?" "Elevated enough," Arbiter said, "that I recommend you prepare for the possibility that ownership of this vessel will not go uncontested." Outside the viewport, the stars looked exactly as they had every night of life, distant, indifferent, unchanging. But for the first time, he found himself wondering how many of those lights hid ships and eyes now turning, slowly and deliberately, toward his little corner of the galaxy. The first sign of trouble arrived 3 days later, disguised as an ordinary docking request. A sleek diplomatic vessel requested berth access to station, citing routine trade inspection as its purpose. Wouldn't have thought twice about it if Arbiter hadn't flagged the ship's transponder the moment it entered sensor range. "That vessel's registered owner has historical ties to the Consolidated Directorate," Arbiter noted, its tone carrying none of the alarm felt building in his chest. The Consolidated Directorate was among the primary signatories of the Concord Suppression Agreement. Probability this visit is coincidental. Low. How low? Statistically negligible. His crew gathered in the hangar that evening, the mood tense in a way it hadn't been since the salvage job that had cost him his limp. Paced while, their weapons specialist, a gruff with a scar-lined face and a healthy distrust of anything that sounded like politics, cleaned a rifle he probably didn't need for a station docking bay. "They're not here for a trade inspection," said flatly. "They're here to confirm what woke up in your hangar, and if they confirm it, they're not going to ask nicely for it back." He was right, and it took less than 2 hours for the situation to prove it. A message arrived through unofficial channels, the kind sent by people who didn't want their names attached to it, offering a generous compensation package for immediate, quiet transfer of the derelict vessel to Directorate custody. No negotiation implied. No second offer promised. Read the message twice, feeling the weight of Arbiter's earlier warning settle fully into place. "They know," he said quietly. "Confirmed," Arbiter replied. "Recommend immediate departure from station. Continued presence increases probability of forced seizure attempts." "Can this ship even fly, really fly?" "Systems are operational at 81% capacity. Sufficient for evasive maneuvers and short-range folded space transit. Not sufficient for sustained combat engagement against a prepared force." It wasn't the reassurance had hoped for, but it was better than nothing. He gathered his crew, explained the situation as plainly as he could, and watched their faces shift from confusion to fear to something harder, a grim determination he recognized because he felt it too. "You don't have to stay for this," he told them. "This isn't your fight. I bought this ship on a whim. I didn't know it'd turn into—" He gestured vaguely at the situation spiraling around them. "This." Crossed her arms, jaw tight. "You think I've spent 3 years fixing junk with you just to bail the one time something actually matters?" Didn't even look up from his rifle. "Where you go, we go. Try not to get us killed." They launched 2 hours before the vessel's boarding window would have expired, slipping out of station's docking ring under the guise of routine departure. It didn't fool anyone for long. Sensors lit up within minutes, not just the diplomatic vessel, but 2 additional warships that had been holding position just beyond scanning range, waiting for exactly this moment. "Multiple hostile contacts converging," Arbiter reported, its calm voice a strange contrast to the alarm blaring through the bridge. Estimated time to intercept, 6 minutes. Gripped the edge of the command console, staring at the tactical display as 3 ships far more powerful than his own began closing the distance with the unhurried confidence of predators who'd already decided the outcome. Arbiter, he said, forcing his voice steady, options. This vessel's current operational status does not favor a defensive engagement. However, a pause, deliberate and weighted. Command authority has not yet been formally established for this vessel. If you wish to access full combat capability, that status must change. Immediately. Do you mean command authority hasn't been established? His voice cracked with the particular panic of a man watching 3 warships close in on a vessel he barely understood. You've been taking my orders for days. I have been cooperating with an unauthorized user within acceptable operational parameters, Arbiter corrected. Full combat systems, weapons authorization, tactical override, folded space combat maneuvering require a rated commander designation. This designation has never been extended to a non-human in the vessel's operational history. Then extend it now. Compatibility assessment required. This process was designed for human command candidates. Its application to non-human personnel is untested. The hostile ships closed another kilometer. His voice cracked through the comm from the engineering deck, tight with barely controlled fear. Whatever you're doing, do it faster. Assessment beginning, Arbiter announced, and felt the bridge lights dim around him as something vast and cold turned its full attention toward him for the first time. Query, why do you wish to command this vessel? It felt like an absurd question given the circumstances, but some instinct told him Arbiter wasn't asking idly. Because if I don't, we all die out here. Because this ship, whatever it is, whatever it was built for, deserves better than being handed over to the same people who tried to erase the truth about it. Because I didn't ask for this, but I'm not going to run from it either. Insufficient. Elaborate on intent regarding use of lethal capability. His jaw tightened, understanding now that Arbiter wasn't testing his courage. It was testing his conscience. I don't want to hurt anyone who isn't trying to hurt us first, but I won't hesitate if it comes to that. Not for my crew's sake. Not after everything you've told me. A long pause. Long enough that genuinely believed he'd failed whatever standard the ship's dead architects had built into it a century ago. Compatibility threshold met, Arbiter finally announced. Provisional command authority granted pending full review. Welcome aboard, Captain. The change was immediate and overwhelming. Every dormant system across the vessel surged to life simultaneously. Weapons batteries unfolding from concealed housings along the hull, targeting arrays humming into alignment, the ship's folded space drive spinning up with a resonance felt in his teeth. For the first time in over a century, the Perdition's reach wasn't just awake. It was ready. Combat systems online, tactical analysis complete, recommend immediate defensive posture. On the main, the 3 hostile vessels, a moment ago so confidently closing the distance, suddenly hesitated, their sensor operators no doubt watching in real time as a derelict junkoction wreck transformed into something their databases had no adequate classification for. The vessel broadcast a final warning, its tone shifting from diplomatic to openly threatening. Unidentified vessel, power down immediately or be fired upon. Looked at the tactical display, at the weapons array now fully online beneath his hands, and felt something settle inside him. Not eagerness for violence, but a grim clarity about what came next. Arbiter, he said quietly, what would humanity have done in this situation? They would not have waited for the first shot, Arbiter replied. They would have ensured there was no need for a second. Exhaled slowly, the weight of the ship's history and its terrible purpose settling fully onto his shoulders for the first time. Then let's make sure of that, he said. Weapons free. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a lesson delivered with the same cold, deliberate precision that had ended a war a century earlier, and it took less than 90 seconds for the 3 hostile vessels to understand exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. The Perdition's reach didn't maneuver like a warship trying to survive an engagement. It moved like something that had already calculated every possible outcome and selected the one requiring the least effort. Folded space thrusters shifted the ship's position in bursts too precise to be anything but computer perfect, closing and opening distance with a fluidity that made the pursuing vessel's targeting systems visibly struggle to compensate. "Enemy formation breaking," reported from engineering, disbelief evident in her voice even as she monitored the ship's own power output climbing to levels she clearly hadn't believed possible an hour earlier. "They're trying to retreat." "Recommend against pursuit," Arbiter advised, though something in its tone suggested the recommendation was more procedural than urgent. "Objective achieved. Hostile withdrawal. Further engagement unnecessary." Watched the tactical display, watched 3 ships that had arrived with total confidence now scrambling to put distance between themselves, and a vessel they'd assumed was defenseless scrap. He felt no triumph in it, only the sober understanding of exactly what he now commanded, and exactly why several governments had spent a century making sure nobody remembered ships like this existed. The weapon that ended the engagement wasn't even the Reach's primary armament. A single disabling strike, precise, restrained, almost gentle by the standards Arbiter, quietly indicated the ship was capable of crippled the lead vessel's drive systems without a single casualty. It was realized a demonstration rather than an attack. A message far louder than any words could deliver. This ship could have ended you and chose not to. The Directorate's remaining ships didn't wait to test whether that restraint would extend a second time. Within the hour, encrypted transmissions began flooding subspace channels across the sector. Panicked reports from the fleeing commanders relayed up chains of command that stretched all the way back to governments who'd spent a century believing their carefully rewritten history was secure. Couldn't intercept the full content, but Arbiter's analysis of the transmission patterns painted a clear enough picture. "Escalating alert status detected across multiple Directorate-affiliated networks," it reported. "Historical suppression protocols have been triggered. Recommend anticipating heightened attention moving forward." "They're panicking," said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice as he studied the sensor readouts. "An accurate characterization," Arbiter agreed. The Perdition's Reach was believed decommissioned along with its sister vessels. Its confirmed reactivation represents a significant deviation from expected historical continuity. Governments invested in maintaining that continuity are unlikely to respond calmly. Sank into the command chair, exhaustion and adrenaline warring inside him as the true scope of what had just happened settled over the bridge. He hadn't just survived an attack. He'd announced, to anyone paying attention across the sector, that the ghost story governments had spent a century burying was real, and it was awake. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to Arbiter. "Now," the AI replied, its tone as level and unbothered as it had been since the moment it first woke. "The galaxy remembers what it spent a century trying to forget." Outside the viewport, the stars continued their indifferent drift, unaware that somewhere among them, an old and terrible truth had just opened its eyes again. In the days that followed, Ash became a name whispered in places he'd never heard of, by people who'd never known he existed a week earlier. The story of the Perdition's Reach spread faster than any official channel could contain it, garbled at first, then increasingly accurate as enough independent witnesses across the sector compared notes. A forgotten human warship, reactivated by a nobody salvager, had faced down 3 Directorate vessels and won without firing a killing shot. It wasn't the victory that shook the galaxy. It was the restraint. A ship capable of ending 3 vessels outright had chosen instead to simply prove that it could, and that single choice terrified old governments more than outright violence ever could have. Restraint implied control. Control implied a plan, and a plan implied that humanity's disappearance had never been retreat at all. Stood on the bridge of the Perdition's Reach, watching sensor feeds of distant fleets quietly repositioning across a dozen systems. Old alliances suddenly reassessing risks they'd assumed settled a century ago. "They're scared," said, arms crossed as she studied the same feeds. "Actually scared. Governments that have run this sector since before any of us were born." "They should be," replied, though there was no satisfaction in the words, only the weight of understanding exactly what he'd inherited. "Query," Arbiter interjected, breaking the quiet tension on the bridge. "You have not yet asked the question I anticipated." Glanced toward the nearest console, aware by now that Arbiter rarely raised anything without purpose. "What question?" "Why humanity did not return for this vessel. Why, if the war truly ended in the decisive victory the historical record confirms, an entire species chose disappearance over dominance. It was a question that had been circling the edges of his mind since the beginning, buried beneath more immediate concerns. "All right," he said. "Why?" "Because winning decisively is not the same as wishing to rule," Arbiter answered. Human command doctrine of that era held a specific philosophy. That overwhelming capability, if openly wielded, corrupts the wielder as surely as it deters the enemy. Humanity did not vanish because it lost. It deliberately, choosing obscurity over empire, understanding that the safest use of power this vessel represents is to never require its use at all. Let that settle, the full shape of the truth finally clicking into place. Humanity hadn't disappeared out of weakness or shame. They disappeared on purpose, stepping back from a galaxy that would have either feared them into submission or begged them into tyranny, choosing instead to leave quietly, trusting that their absence would speak louder than their presence ever could. Until now. Until a junk auction and a stubborn salvager had accidentally cracked open a secret that was never meant to resurface, not out of malice, but simply because the universe rarely stays buried forever. "So what happens to a species that gave up power on purpose?" asked quietly, "when their ghost fleet wakes up without them?" "An unprecedented scenario," Arbiter admitted. "This unit's programming did not account for reactivation under non-human command absent direct humanity contact. However, analysis suggests one probable outcome. Which is, the galaxy will search for humanity again," Arbiter said. "Not out of curiosity, out of fear. A species capable of building and voluntarily silencing power like this is no longer a forgotten footnote. It is once again a question every remaining power will need answered." Looked out at the stars stretching endlessly beyond the viewport, no longer indifferent in his eyes but watchful, charged with a tension that hadn't existed a week earlier. Somewhere out there, old governments were scrambling to reassess a threat they'd spent a century convincing themselves didn't exist. Somewhere out there, perhaps, humanity itself was still watching, still waiting, exactly as Arbiter had been. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a diplomat or a soldier or anyone the galaxy would have chosen for this role. He was a junk auction salvager who'd bought a wreck on a whim and found himself holding the single loudest question the galaxy had asked in 100 years. Where did humanity go, and what happens now that their warning has woken up? The stars offered no answer, but for the first time in over a century, the perdition's reach was no longer waiting in silence for one.